I am worried about our national vocabulary. I'm worried about our way of speaking and thinking, which often begins with an idealized us and then moves swiftly to define and discredit a rigidly conceived them. Language has gone from being a bridge to being a barricade, separating us from one another. Words that exacerbate the differences between us have been tasked with sorting us into camps and activating our knee-jerk outrage and mistrust. To a certain extent, this is even true of the ways we sometimes describe ourselves. Are you easygoing or difficult? Scattered or controlling? And if you settle for shorthands like these, how many of your actual needs and capacities are you denying, downplaying, or joking away? How about the people in your midst? Are they hardworking or needy? Resourceful or shady? And what do labels like these encourage us to think, say, do, and refuse to do? But if our habits and language have helped acclimate us to a national vocabulary of fear and division, and by extension, a climate of toxic and sometimes lethal disregard, perhaps it stands to reason that changing our way of hearing and using language can help play a role in transcending our current state. So, this is where I stand before you and say that poetry, an art form some of you may have been encouraged to mistrust or to write off as overly niche, is actually a very practical tool for overcoming an increasing threat to our future: the weapon of vague, inaccurate, and misleading language. Feeling and responding to the effects of a poem, any poem, is one way of pushing back against forms of oversimplification and erasure that reduce us to types, numbers, obstacles, and targets. I don't say this because I think there's only one way of reading a poem, nor because I believe that poems can or should feed us our values and opinions, but rather because poetry rewards our desire for honesty, and it authorizes us to insist upon language adequate to our actual depth and complexity. This is a theory that emerges from my experience as Poet Laureate of the United States. During that time, I was determined to push back against the narrative of America as a divided nation. The narrative that says people in the rural heartland have nothing in common with those in urban centers, and that differences in race, class, religion, and citizenship status have carved us into a puzzle that will never be pieced back together. I also wanted to test out my own hope that Americans of all backgrounds might have something quietly urgent and humanizing to offer one another. If only we could turn down the volume on all the many sources seeking to sell us on the notion of an unmendable divide, to hook us on a product, which is strife. In the laureateship, I visited small towns from Alaska to Louisiana. And in each of these places, I would find myself gathering with a room full of strangers to read poems aloud together and talk about what we noticed, remembered, wondered, and felt. Simply and quietly, we found our way to a counter-narrative of careful listening and mutual respect. Poems reminded us of the things that we share, while also highlighting the differences between us, advocating implicitly for the validity of our differing perspectives. This is why it makes perfect sense to me that we can change our relationship to language and to reality itself by spending time with poems. Poetry counteracts the effects of everyday language, which often placates us with the notion that nothing much is happening, or else shocks us into passivity by blowing things out of proportion. Poems pull you into your body, allowing you to see, hear, and feel things for yourself. They bridge the distance between me and my worry, my overwhelm, or my joy, and you, way over there, in what may seem at first to be a totally different reality. Poems even bridge the kinds of distances that we don't often tend to acknowledge, like the distance between who we are and who we think we are, or between how we feel and how we might one day come or allow ourselves to feel. This is a poem by the late American poet Jack Gilbert, which forges a unique vocabulary for the experience of grief. Michiko, dead. He manages, like somebody carrying a box that is too heavy, first with his arms underneath. When their strength gives out, he moves his hands forward, hooking them on the corners, pulling the weight against his chest. He moves his thumbs slightly when the fingers begin to tire, and it makes different muscles take over. Afterward, he carries it on his shoulder until the blood drains out of the arm that is stretched up to steady the box, and the arm goes numb. But now the man can hold underneath again, so that he can go on without ever putting the box down. The man in Gilbert's poem, a widower, isn't weeping or wailing. He's not in shock or denial. Even if he is, those terms are too familiar and automatic, too depleted of fresh life force to get to the heart of this man's unique experience of loss. The poem's central metaphor, which likens one thing, grief, to another, schlepping a heavy box, reminds us that in the height and the depths of extreme emotion, the words normally tasked with describing these feelings don't cut it. And so the poem sidesteps our usual vocabulary for loss, resorting instead to images that activate our bodily senses and our sense of experiential memory, drawing us into what feels like active participation in the feelings and the determination the poem describes. Michiko Dead puts another person's burden in your hands. A different poem might give you access to someone else's questions or regrets or bliss. Poems shake us out of the fixed terms with which we have essentially been trained to defend ourselves against one another. They assure us that no matter who you and I believe ourselves to be, I can go so far as to corroborate a piece of your story, and you can do the same for me. The language of poetry isn't so much a particular vocabulary as it is a behavior in language and thought, an insistence that in order to observe and reflect, we must call upon our own reserves of memory, sensory awareness, and imagination, and a belief that nothing is pat, nothing is fixed, things change, and feelings drift into oncoming lanes, which is why in other poems on the very same topic, the poet Jack Gilbert goes on to describe grief in very different ways, because we need a wide and living field of language, as opposed to a narrow, fixed one, in order to describe and understand ourselves and others, let alone to name or make imaginable our hopes for the future. So I opened by talking about a facet of our shared political reality. And why am I not still talking about politics? Why is poetry, of all things, relevant to the topic of polarization? Another version of this question, which poets are often asked, is, does poetry matter? But why not ask, does imagination matter? How about patience, courage, vulnerability, hope, and awe? Do we value these traits? Do we prize a world in which they exist? Poetry matters so much that I have come to imagine that the question itself, does poetry matter, must actually be a ploy intended to swindle us out of the innate human capacities from which this age-old art form emerges. Because to care about poetry is to listen in earnest to another person's testimony and to attend to a host of faculties that equip you to consider yourself alongside and in light of equally worthy others. I believe we have a responsibility not just to our own inner circle, but to the world of strangers with whom we share this planet. Like it or not, the things that I do or refuse to do eventually ripple out to you. And the reverse is also true. And so, I would like to invite you to imagine that the solution to our crisis of division has much to do with challenging ourselves to listen better to one another and to insist upon an exchange of terms worthy of our genuine complexity. Listening together and listening to one another means that inevitably things will strike me differently than they strike you, and that's okay. In fact, that is the point. Poetry is a tool for becoming better and better at approaching ourselves and others in the fullness of our humanity. Every line and image that speaks to you in a poem, every detail that startles you into a fuller degree of attention, reinvigorates your relationship not just to language, but to the world of people, animals, and the environment. Images and metaphors, these seemingly tiny literary operations, are actually fodder for a radical empathy and a more courageous commitment to the wider cultures that we participate in. I'd like to close with one of my own poems, written as a way of bearing witness to this current moment of division and strife. More than an expression of what I feel, the poem is an attempt to imagine the world and my place in it differently. An old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream, the worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now gone. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Close your eyes. How do you see the world? How do you feel within it? Don't just answer those questions the way you always do. Choose different nouns and verbs, ones that seem to put you down on the ground in a place you know or one you need to know. Linger there, paying better attention than is usually required of you. Now you're thinking like a poem. Open your eyes, but keep going down that path. Gradually, you may find that you've moved beyond a view of the world as it is and toward a vision of the world as it might one day, with courage and love, become. Thank you.